Hi everyone, welcome to this first seminar of 2026 for the Cognitive Neuroscience Hub. I'm Iwas Dumontet, I'm the new Deputy Director standing in for Natalia. So welcome. So today we have Edward O to talk to us about work memory and attention. So Edward is a cognitive neuroscientist who received a doctoral degree from the University of Michigan, training with doctors John Edis and Edward Smith. And then he spent 2 years at UC San Diego working with Dr. Hal Pashler and Dr. Steve Hilliard. And Ed took his first professor position at the University of Oregon in 1999, where he spent 16 years and developed a close collaboration with Dr. Ed Vogel. And in 2015, they both took position at the University of Chicago, where he still is now. And Ed's core research interests focus on working memory and attention with an eye towards the intertwined nature of these two constructs. And that's what we'll hear about today. So we're very happy to have you come talk to us about your research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for welcoming me here. I'm really excited to show you what we've been thinking about and to meet you and talk to you. So I want to start off by giving credit to these two gentlemen. This is Henry Jones. He's a fifth-year doctoral student who's about to graduate, to my dismay. And this is Darius Suplica, who just graduated from undergrad at UChicago last spring. And I'll just say, I've been working with students for about 30 years now, and just by coincidence, these are the best two doctoral and undergrad students I've ever worked with in my career. I think it's pretty safe to say. So I'm really lucky in the last several years to have been able to do multiple projects with these two guys. And I hope that you'll remember their names because they are incredible students. So working memory is typically defined verbally as the online workspace of the mind, the things that you're holding in mind at any given moment, and is critical for complex cognition or ongoing cognition of almost every variety. And I want to point out that if you look at the history of the neuroscience of working memory, it has been almost entirely focused on neural signals that track the stored content. So for example, on the left, this is work from Goldman-Retich's lab, where they're looking at cells that have location-specific preferences indicated by their position around this circle. And this shows you a trial where the animal was remembering a 6 o'clock spatial position, and you see the cell with that preference had elevated firing during the delay period. Over here is an EEG study that I did with Josh Foster from New Zealand. And now what we can do with this is use inverted encoding models that we apply to the topography of alpha activity, and it tracks the location that subjects are covertly attending. And you can do that in a fairly time-resolved fashion throughout the delay period of a working memory task as well. So I think this genre of work has been really important, trying to understand how content is maintained, how perceptual regions of the brain are participating in things like imagery and working memory maintenance. But today I want to try to convince you that this is only part of the story, and that we should also pay attention to a different class of neural activity. So in addition to this neural activity that tracks the stored content, I'd like to draw your attention to content-independent signals that we can find with various neuroscience methods. I'll be showing you EEG experiments today, but they track the number of stored items that you're holding in working memory. And it's not really just the number of items, but really I think maybe the best word is the number of chunks, the number of entities that you're holding in memory. So it could be one letter, it could be a word, it could be even a phrase, I suspect, and that you can kind of keep track of those high-level representations with these sorts of neural signals that track this kind of number. Now, to try to illustrate why this is an interesting idea, or why we need this construct of tracking the number of things, and that is separate from content, I like to show this video. Octopus is really an amazing animal, right? So you start off and you're looking at a piece of seaweed, and then it changes its texture and its color and its shape, and it swims off in a cloud of ink. And it's just amazing how they can metamorph like this in such a brief period of time. But one thing I would wager with you is that you weren't really confused at any point about the number of animals that you were tracking in that video. The low-level features of that octopus at the beginning and the end of the video have no relationship to each other. There is no commonality in color, spatial frequency, texture, shape, location. Everything is different. And yet you could effortlessly track it as it moved through this dynamic event that you were observing, much like you would be able to do with the transformer robots in this movie, right? They are doing these amazing transformations, but you know exactly what you're looking at. You know how many robots there are in this particular scene. So this, the idea I'd like to highlight is that perceptual continuity requires this kind of spatiotemporal tracking. That to know that an entity that you are observing is the same as the entity that you saw earlier in a dynamic event. You need to be able to keep track of it without relying on low-level features or really any kind of content in this particular video. And this kind of spatiotemporal tracking operation has been proposed in various theories of dynamic cognition to be really important for just basic operations like acting upon an object. If you want to reach out and grab a mug of coffee as you're walking by your desk, its retinal position is constantly changing, the angle, the lighting, everything is changing, but you must have a consistent and clear record of which item you are targeting with your fingertips. And we're really good at this. And so people like Polishin and Kahneman have argued that we need something to track these sorts of items that is not dependent on the content or the low-level features of those items. So this is what we need for continuous representation of items in dynamic events. And those dynamic events are pretty much almost every event that we experience. Despite our love of static displays that are flashed in cognitive labs, it's really not the way our lives tend to unfold, right? Now, one critical thing about these theories that people have raised, and I'm talking about fingers of instantiation that Zen and Polishin talked about, and I'm talking about object files that Kahneman, Treisman, and Gibbs talked about, they were referring to indexing operations that allow you to keep track of an entity or an item. And they really emphasized, particularly Zen and Polishin's writings, emphasized the idea that these things really need to operate independently of the attended feature values of the content that is stored. And so this is part of the theoretical motivation for what we've been referring to in our lab as content independent pointers. Pointers just being a shorthand for this kind of spatiotemporal tracking operation. Okay, so how have we tried to study this? Well, really what I'm going to show you today is a focus on evidence that there is in fact a neural signal tracking storage in working memory that really is separable from the neural signals that track the feature values or the content that's being stored. And we're going to do so with EEG activity. So these are electrodes that are placed on the scalp of the subject, and we can vary in an experiment the different set sizes that we are presenting to subjects. So let's say 3 colors, 1 color, 4 colors, etc. In this next experiment, or in some of the experiments I'll show you, we vary that from 1 to 4 items or even a larger range of set sizes. And the key approach that we've been using most recently is to pay attention to the pattern of voltage across the 30 electrodes that we have on their scalp. So essentially we're examining the topography of the electrical voltage on the scalp. And the cool thing is that what we'll see is that there's a kind of consistent topography that we will observe as a function of the number of chunks or items that a person is holding in mind. So here's what we get with 1 color, 2 colors, 3, 4. And so you see that there's kind of this clear, an orderly progression as you move upwards in load. And this will vary to some extent as a function of the type of material that subjects are paying attention to. But what I'm going to try to convince you of is that there is a core aspect of this topography that is in fact in common across very different stimuli, and that this seems to be this content independent process that we are hypothesizing. So what we're doing is training a multivariate classifier to learn what the voltage topography for load 1, 2, 3, 4 is. and then use that learned topography to then decode how many items are being stored in an independent set of data. By the way, I'm totally fine with questions at any time, so to interrupt me at any time if anything's unclear. This approach is really effective. We've been using it with all sorts of different stimuli. It's even good enough that we can get above chance classification of load. If chance is 25%, because we've got 4 set sizes, we can get up to about 30%, even at the single trial level, which is kind of ridiculous with EEG. If you look at a single trial of EEG, it just looks like an earthquake, right? But we can still pull out information using this technique. And if we average together about 15 or 20 trials, we can get up to 50 or 60% accuracy in the same kind of conditions. So it's really quite sensitive to variations in load. One of the first things that we noticed was that it really generalizes nicely between different visual features. We train a model on colors and then test it on an independent data set where they're remembering different numbers of orientations. There's really nice, almost perfect generalization between those visual features going in both directions. Another critical point is that if we have subjects remember both the color and the orientation of each item, the 1 item, 2 item load signals over here look just like the 1 and 2 item load signals in the single feature conditions. So this is backing up my claim that this is a chunk-based measure of load. It's about the number of things that you're remembering. It doesn't really seem to be well predicted by the information load of the memory task that you're performing. And in another example of this, Henry Jones did an experiment where he showed that you can also generalize between memory for the number of motion coherence patches that a subject is remembering and memory for the number of colors. And we chose those 2 things in particular because they are the most cortically disparate visual features that we could think of. So you can easily tell whether subjects are remembering motion or color based on ongoing EEG activity because very different regions of the visual cortex are activated. Nevertheless, we also find this beautiful generalization of the load component of that signal as well. So we really think that in the visual domain, we have pretty good evidence for an item-based signal that doesn't care too much about what type of information is being maintained. And this is what kind of got us on the trail of these content-independent pointer ideas. So what I want to show you today next is an examination we did of the same kind of question, but now we wanted to test whether we could go between sensory modalities and still observe this common signature of the number of items that people are holding in memory. So we're going to look at visual and auditory modalities in these working memory tasks. This is a question that, did I just draw that? That was totally unintentional. This is a question that's been asked in previous research. There's been EEG studies that have shown, for example, that if you vary the number of tones that a person is holding in memory, you'll find this increasing negativity in these central frontal electrodes here. And if you vary the number of colors that a person is holding in working memory, you'll find a similar looking increasing negativity in these posterior electrodes. This is the contralateral delay activity, or the CDA, that Ed Vogel documented back in about 2004. And people have examined this empirical pattern and noticed that they're in different locations on the scalp and argued, as I would have argued when I was in grad school, that this is evidence in favor of Baddeley's model, that you can divide up working memory based on context, that different storage systems may be called into play depending on the type of information that people are holding in memory. And what I'll show you in the next experiment is that we do replicate that concept. We show that there are demonstrable differences in electrical patterns when people are holding auditory and visual things in working memory. However, I'll also try to convince you that there is a clear common component that moves in concert regardless of the sensory modality of what people are holding in working memory. All right, so this is a paper that just came out a couple years ago. Darius Suplica, the undergrad, the superstar I just showed you, he's the first author on this paper. And in this first experiment, what we're doing is presenting these audio-visual events. So what you see here is a diamond that was presented either on the left, middle, or right side of the screen, and it was spatially and temporally coincident with a sound that was played simultaneously with the onset of the diamond. The sounds were supposed to be real-world sounds like saxophone, car horn, zipper. We were collaborating with an audio psychophysics colleague who did all these beautiful controls of onset time and duration and energy and all this stuff that kind of rendered them very difficult to recognize, I thought, but nevertheless, they were discriminable from each other. So they served pretty well as memory stimuli. Now, what you see here is one of the memory, these sort of audio-visual events. In the second screen here, you see what we refer to as placeholder stimuli. So we told our subjects, if you see this gray diamond, or if you hear a white noise patch instead of one of these more recognizable sounds, these are placeholders that shouldn't concern you. Don't store them in memory. And we only included these basically to equate the sensory energy as the load was being manipulated in our experiment. So in this top row, you see a load 1 trial, and we are testing them in this case on the color that they were presented in that particular trial. Now on the bottom row, we see a load 2 trial because we have 2 saturated colors and 2 sounds that are being presented at the same time. And another critical manipulation was subjects were told in different blocks of the experiment to either remember only the sounds, only the colors, or both the sound and the color of each audiovisual event that they saw in the display. Okay, so we're manipulating which aspect of the stimuli they're storing, and we're manipulating the number of stimuli that they're storing in working memory. And at the end, they're doing a change detection task to so that we can keep them honest for holding information in mind. Now, if we try to run a multivariate classifier, it's successful. It works quite effectively. What you're seeing here on the y-axis is something that we refer to as hyperplane contrast. The hyperplane is the dividing line between the visual, between load 1 and load 2 conditions in our classifier. The hyperplane contrast refers to the separation between the load 1 and the load 2 conditions. And it's a little bit different from just a raw accuracy score because it corrects for some main effects biases that you can find when you're going between different modalities or things like that. So the simple way to understand this plot is that up is better classification performance. It shows a bigger multivariate separation between the load conditions that we're trying to discriminate. And so as you can see, if we train with auditory trials and we test an held out set of auditory trials, we can indeed well above chance classify how many sounds a person is holding in memory during the delay period of the experiment, and that is sustained throughout this blank delay period that you see here. Similarly with visual, if we train it up, we can tell you how many visual things the person is holding in mind during that blank delay period that is after the presentation. This gray bars, they show the presentation duration, essentially, when the serial presentations were occurring. Now, what about cross-training? If we train on auditory stimuli, can we succeed in classifying the number of visual items that a person's holding in a different set of data? And the answer is yes, we see almost perfect generalization. We get almost as good performance when we train on auditory and test on visual, or train on visual and test on auditory, as we do in the within modality conditions. We do find some reliable points where that is not the case, where we're a little bit worse in the cross-training condition. And this kind of makes sense because even if we believe that there is this robust content-independent aspect of the load signature, there's nothing to prevent there from being content-specific aspects of load as well. We're not ruling that out at all. In fact, I'll show you some evidence that there are content-specific things going on. And so if we think about that a little bit more carefully, then we realize that there's kind of a picture like this, that even if there is a modality general aspect of storage going on in these neural patterns, we're also expecting that there may be interesting, important modality-specific components of the neural signals as well. And so here's where Henry Jones came in. He actually entered the lab about a year and a half after we had started this project, but he came up with the idea of using another an analytic technique that would allow us to try to survey more of this entire space at one time by looking at both modality general and modality specific aspects of the neural activity. And his suggestion was that we use representational similarity analysis. So in a lot of these types of experiments, the key dependent measure is the voltage on the scalp or the accuracy of decoding based on that voltage. But in RSA analyses, what we're really going to focus on is the similarity between different conditions in the experiment. So what you see here is a grid in which on the vertical and horizontal axes, we have all 6 conditions of the experiment that I just showed you: auditory set size 1 and 2, visual set size 1 and 2, and conjunction set size 1 and 2. And each of the cells color here that you see shows you the empirical results of a similarity analysis that we got between all possible pairs of conditions. The metric for similarity here is essentially, it's a Mahalanobis distance. It's the multivariate distance in 30-dimensional space between each of these pairs of conditions. So it's a pretty straightforward metric, actually. You can also think about it as classifiability. The easier it is to discriminate 2 conditions with a classifier, the less similar they are then deemed to be in this representational similarity analysis. Okay, so our goal with RSA is to test theoretical factors that will allow us to predict this similarity structure that you see in this matrix. And one cool thing about it is that we can test more than one theoretical factor at a time at each moment in time in our experiment. So for example, here's one theoretical factor that we refer to as the pointer model, where essentially we're arguing that similarity should be shaped in this experiment by the number of items people are holding in memory, where any set size 1 trial will be identical to any other set size 1 trial, and same for set size 2 trials, and that's independent of what they happen to be holding in memory about those items that are being stored. At the same time, we tested a couple of other theoretical models. Here's one that predicted similarity based on the total number of features that subjects were holding in memory. So as load 1 goes to load 2, you're doubling the number of features. And if you make it a conjunction stimulus, where they're remembering both auditory and visual, then you get even more feature values. And our question was, can this kind of information load model also explain interesting variance in the similarity structure of this experiment? And then finally, here's one where they're just determined similarities predicted here entirely based on the modality. So visual trials will be similar to visual trials, auditory to auditory, and conjunction trials will fall in between. They'll be half similar to auditory and half similar to visual trials. So what happens if we run this model on the data that I just showed you is that we get 2 of these theoretical factors working really well, explaining pretty substantial variance as EEG activity goes with RSA, where we can certainly track similarity based on the number of items that people are holding, regardless of the modality of those items. And we can also track the modality that they are storing. Is it auditory, is it visual, or is it conjunction trials where they remember both? That's also a quite successful model. Turns out the number of features they were storing had no predictive power in this particular experiment. Now this is a multidimensional scaling plot of the similarities between the 6 conditions in the experiment, and it's kind of instructive to look at it. What we're doing here is trying to come up with a 2D picture that will preserve the similarity, the distances between all of the different pairs of conditions in the experiment. And what you can see is some nice order in this MDS plot, where the set size 1 conditions are all up and to the left, set size 2 conditions are down and to the right. And then as content varies, we also see this order in the display where visual is on the left, auditory is on the right, and then conjunctions reasonably enough fall in between the visual and the auditory conditions. And here you can easily kind of envision how there seem to be separable axes in the multivariate space that separate load from the ones that separate the content in the neural signals. And I think this is a nice kind of way to resolve these different perspectives that have been in the literature, where some people have argued there are different systems for different types of information, and that is to some extent true. But there's also this real commonality in how different numbers of chunks will influence the neural signatures, and that's independent of the content. So those kind of coexist within this framework. Now, there's an important confound in the experiment that I just showed you. As we were varying the number of items people were holding in memory, we were also varying the number of spatial positions that were relevant to the subject in the different experiments, in the different conditions of that experiment. And that turns out to be a really important confound, because in fact, we can track the number of positions that people are paying attention to, and even exactly which positions they're paying attention to. So we really need to examine that as a possible alternative explanation of the load signal that I just showed you, which I was arguing is content independent. If it just means that they were attending the same number of positions, well, that's not really quite the demonstration that I was hoping for, right? What we're going to do is show you a new design that addresses that particular confound. This is just my conclusions. We've got great cross-training between visual, auditory, and conjunction conditions. We get a pointer signal, therefore, that seems to be independent of the attended features. And the interesting thing about RSA is that when you find good variance that is explained for a theoretical factor, it is specifically unique variance that's being explained. So in other words, what we're showing is that there's clear variance in the activity explained by content and by load, but they are distinct aspects of the EEG signal. So that kind of goes along with this notion that those are separable aspects of working memory function. Okay, here's the experiment that takes care of the spatial attention confound. What Darius did in this experiment was to use very similar displays with audiovisual events and placeholder events. But in some trials of the experiment, the three audiovisual events were all in different locations, right, middle, and left. And in other trials of the experiment, they all were presented on one location. Here they are all on the right. They could, of course, be in the middle or the left-hand position as well. So what we now have, we're also varying load this time between 1 and 3 items instead of 1 and 2 items. We're taking out the conjunction condition because this is already about a 4-hour experiment for our subjects in the booth, and we didn't have time to add in that condition. It takes a really long time, but you get super clean, awesome data. I highly recommend it. Now we've got independent orthogonal manipulations of the number of items they're holding in memory, the modality of the items that they're holding in memory, either audio or visual, and the number of spatially attended positions, either 3 or 1. So here are our theoretical factors. This is our empirical actual results of our similarity matrix between all of the different conditions of the experiment. We had one model that we tested that actually this time looked at auditory load specifically. Is there something in the EEG pattern that tells us how many sounds they're remembering? If it's a visual trial, the answer is there's 0 sounds, and all trials will be identical to each other on that metric, right? But if it's auditory, it depends on how many sounds are being remembered. We made an analogous model for the number of colors that the subject was holding in memory. Now kind of doesn't matter how many sounds they're remembering. And then we have one model for the spatial number of spatially attended positions. It's either 1 or 3. You get this checkerboard pattern where all conditions with 1 attended position will be identical to each other, and with 3 identical to each other. And then finally, our pointer model, where it's just based on the number of items that they're holding in memory, either 1 item or 3 items, irrespective of the sensory modality of those items. So which of these 4 models will explain reliable variance in the similarity structure of the experiment? In this case, what I'm going to do is show you the data in a time-resolved way. So what we're doing is starting here at the beginning of the trial where the sample onsets and going through the 3 sequence. It's a sequential presentation of 3 events. And then finally the blank delay period out here. And what you'll see here is when we look at the visual and auditory load models that looked at this modality-specific aspect of load, we actually have success with both models to some extent. For the auditory model, it's mainly working during the sensory presentation period of the trial. It's not really quite making it above chance over here, although maybe it would if we had a lot more subjects. And then in the visual model, we're actually seeing a pretty reasonable signal that lasts throughout the entire presentation period and the delay period of the experiment. So here we are seeing some sensory specific aspects of storage and of storage load in this experiment. The spatial attention model was highly successful. It works in every experiment. We've done it in quite a few experiments now. What you see is that it jumps off of the baseline at the first moment in time where you could logically distinguish between set size one location attended and 3 locations attended, because for the first presentation, there's no way to tell. Everything will have a unique position, right? Then it starts off explaining a very large amount of variance and then kind of dives down monotonically and is gone by around 1200, 1500 milliseconds or so. It's not really that compellingly above chance anymore. And we see this empirical pattern in several different projects now. But it is very clear that there's important variance being explained in similarity structure by the number of attended positions. And then finally, with all of those other factors simultaneously taken into account, that's one cool thing about RSA, right, is that you're kind of simultaneously observing these things and showing that there's unique variance explained by each factor. We still get a quite robust pointer signal. That is, we can show that this model that predicts similarity based only on the number of things in memory, regardless of modality, is working all through this presentation period and throughout the entire blank delay period as well. So I think this is a really nice kind of confirmation of the findings from the first experiment, and it does so while controlling for that key confound of spatial attention and load. They also, another thing that kind of separates spatial attention and load is that they have these very different time courses, one dying down quickly and the other one holding level, as long as the subject's trying to hold that information in mind. Now we can also do a multi-dimensional scaling plot of this experiment. We have to do a 3-dimensional plot this time because we had 3 factors, and it looks really orderly, but let me help you out here. If we put some colored panels, what you see is that the visual conditions are on the left side, the auditory conditions are on the right side. When they're attending 3 locations, that's in the front. 1 location is in the back. And load 3 is on the top and load 1 is on the bottom. And that all combines to make this really easy Rubik's Cube. But it's just really nice, I think, to see how orderly this multidimensional scaling plot is. And once again, you can kind of envision how there are these seemingly perpendicular axes that track load, content, and spatial attention in this experiment. And I'm really interested in following up on this apparent dissociation between spatial attention and working memory storage. I would argue that both of those processes should probably be best thought of as a form of voluntary attention. That we know that you can look at a screen with X number of items on it and voluntarily select which ones are going to enter working memory. People have that ability. It varies quite a bit across observers in a stable way, but it's a key aspect of our ability to engage selective attention. But also you can decide which locations to pay attention to. And what we keep finding over and over again is that spatial attention and working memory gating are separable aspects of neural activity. And if you are spatially attending an object and even categorizing it, you need not be obligated to enter it into working memory. So they're really quite different animals. And I think that they're not really well discriminated in many parts of our literature where we're talking about voluntary attentional control. Okay, let's see. So study 2, what did we find? More evidence for these content-independent load signals that now generalize between visual and auditory modalities. We're proposing that this may be, that one theoretically consistent account is that content-independent activity may track this kind of spatiotemporal pointer operation, although I will admit that this is a working hypothesis It fits really well with a lot of interesting theories that kind of come together in these domains, but I think that we need more direct evidence and more ways to attack this question of whether pointers per se are the right way to interpret this load activity. And then finally, as I was just kind of arguing, this dissociation between pointer deployment and covert spatial attention, I think, could be a really useful one in different parts of our literature. For example, when we talk about attentional capture or distractor suppression, are we capturing spatial attention or are we observing intrusions of distractors into working memory? Those are really different stories, and they are not typically differentiated in most of the experiments on these phenomena. This is a really long theory figure, which I figured out in my past 2 talks. I don't have time to present to you. It's in a Trends in Cognitive Science paper that Ed Vogel and I published that kind of gives our whole world view of how this all fits together. But it shows this separation between pointers and spatial attention. It talks about our hypothesis that working memory may be sort of a gateway for the formation of accessible episodic long-term memories. And I'm just going to skip this because I really want to get to the last empirical result, which is an examination of whether the pointers I've been talking to you about, are they really a key aspect of working memory capacity? Do they really allow us to track individual differences in working memory ability? This is one of the aspects of this whole construct of working memory capacity that makes it interesting, right? We know that working memory capacity is a powerful predictor of fluid intelligence, scholastic achievement, career success. All these interesting things are predicted by it. Is this neural model that I'm presenting to you relevant to these variations across individuals? So does the pointer signal that we're looking at actually provide a limit for working memory capacity? This is sort of our working hypothesis now, is that it is an item-based neural signal, and we believe it may provide one way to think about apparent item-based limits in working memory capacity in various behavioral experiments. The chunk-based nature of capacity limits, I think, is not that controversial, right? You can remember about the same number of words as you can letters, and about the same number of memorized pairs of words as you can remember words. So the chunk-based nature of capacity is fairly established, I would argue. This appears to be a chunk-based neural signal that tracks load. Is it tracking this kind of capacity limit? So if that's the case, we should be able to see some interesting contrasts between higher and lower ability subjects when we focus in on this content-independent activity. Now, one thing about the experiments I've shown you so far, we were varying between loads 1 and 2 and 1 and 3. And for our classifiers, the ground truth for what was being stored in working memory was presumed to be whatever we presented to the subjects, right? They are always presumed to store everything we gave them. But to look at individual differences, you have to go beyond people's capacity. And this turned out to be a pretty important technical challenge for this method that I'm showing you. How do we actually measure the number of pointers that are deployed when the set size is no longer providing the ground truth for the number of things that people are storing in memory? And so with this, Henry Jones came into play once again. He's super awesome, quantitatively sophisticated, but psychologically he's a real psychologist who also is interested in using quantitative methods, like many of the people here. And that's something I really value. I think that we have these amazing computational theorists who can also really connect it to these basic theoretical constructs. So what Henry came up with, and it really was Henry, and there's a lot about what I'm about to present to you that maybe Phil would understand way better than me, but I'll try to describe it to you as effectively as I can. It's a hierarchical Bayesian regression approach that is using the same kind of representational similarity approach. So he's kind of looking at the similarity between different conditions, and he's looking at individual subject parameter values, but they're informed by the broader aggregate parameter values that he's estimating. And he's able to make a few basic assumptions to try to predict what the shape of the load activity, this content-independent load activity, looks like as we go across a much wider range of set sizes. So let me show you the rather complicated experiment that Henry put together to examine this. So this is a really Baroque experimental design, but bear with me here. So What they're remembering in this experiment is numbers of colors. In this case, they varied between 2, 4, 6, and 8 colors that they were holding in memory. In half of the conditions, we had some gray discs that served as placeholders to control the sensory energy across the different load conditions. In the other half of the trials, those placeholders were removed because Henry wanted to actually see what variance is accounted for by this act of filtering out the placeholders in this experiment. The short story there is that not much variance was explained by the placeholder exclusion process. So I won't say too much more about that. We also have a variation in task set. So in one task set, subjects were told, remember these colors, and we're later going to test you on the color that was in the position in this test display. But in the other half of the experiment, subjects were doing a spatial attention task. So what they were told was, note where these colored squares are, but don't remember them. Just direct covert spatial attention to those locations. On rare trials, about 10% of the time, you will see two numbers on the screen. One of those numbers will be in one of the positions that you're supposed to be covertly attending. Note whether that is an odd or an even number, and you'll be reporting that at the end of the trial. All right, so basically he's given them a task where they have to hold covert spatial attention at specific locations for a sustained period of time, waiting for these rare numbers to occur. We throw out all the trials where the numbers occur, and we analyze the rest of them so that they are physically similar to the trials that we were measuring working memory activity in. Now, the striking thing about Henry's prediction here is that in this spatial attention task, whoops, sorry. Did I go the wrong way there? Yes. In this spatial attention task, the prediction is that load in working memory will be 0 for all conditions, regardless of whether you're spatially attending 2, 4, 6, or 8 distinct positions. And here, we're really kind of offering a provocative definition of working memory, because spatial attention requires maintenance of information. If you're attending 4 empty positions during a delay period, you need to remember those positions somehow, right? But what we're arguing is that because there are no items that are actually being stored from those positions, that while spatial attention is a process that requires the sustained maintenance of information about locations, it is distinct from the process that allows you to hold different numbers of chunks in working memory. And it is not the same as the process that determines individual differences in working memory. So kind of arguing that working memory storage needs to go beyond information maintenance in its definition for us to tap into the processes that explain individual differences, and that I think are really the limiting factor for all of these behavioral experiments looking at these item-based capacity limits. But that is a pretty strong assumption, which I'll show you some support for in this experiment. And we do have previous experiments where we've shown that spatial attention alone does not evoke contralateral delay activity, for example. So there are multiple studies now that kind of point towards this division. So what do we get then in this experiment? Well, here is the empirical similarity matrix in this experiment. There's a lot of conditions in this experiment. And here is what we would predict based on the number of spatially attended positions. Remember that in all of these different spatial attention conditions, load is presumed to be 0 in working memory. If we look at working memory load, we can predict the difference between 2, 4, 6, and 8. You see this banded structure here, which is showing that 2 is more similar to 4 than it is to 6, and even less similar to 8. So that's represented in these predictions. And here is the predictions of similarity based on sensory energy, the number of objects on the screen, essentially. And one cool thing about this data set is that if you look at the empirical similarity matrix, you can kind of see the presence of each of these theoretical factors laid over each other in the data that we obtained, right? And that's kind of nice. So here is the amount of activity that we saw. So this is Henry quantifying the number of pointers that are deployed. As you go up on the y-axis on this right-hand graph, more pointer activity is presumed to be present in the display or in that condition. And what you see is that it rises up to set size 2, and it kind of flattens out as you go to across set sizes 4, 6, and 8. So it is not really increasing much after set size 2. I'm going to show you a follow-up where we have a more fine-grained set of set sizes that will answer some important questions. For spatial attention, we're rising up from 2 locations to 4 locations, and then not really going up much more after that, actually. And then sensory load, we see it's just a monotonic rising function across all. As the number of objects on the screen increases, so does the inferred sensory energy in those displays. What I want to really focus on, though, is this working memory load function, because this is what we believe is tracking working memory storage independent of sensory energy and independent of the spatial attention that subjects are deploying. And what I want to do is show you what this looks like as a function of individual differences in working memory capacity. Now, this individual difference effort has been going on for a very long time, and there's one critical empirical pattern that I want to show you from past work in these types of experiments. So here, again, you see this kind of Luck and Vogel style change detection experiment where they see a bunch of colored squares, a very brief retention interval, and here they're asked to detect, did any color change in that display? And one interesting thing that's been observed in multiple labs and multiple papers is that if you look at the actual number of colors that subjects seem to be able to hold in memory, sometimes this is called Cowan's K, what you'll see is that as you go from set size 1 all the way to set size 8, there's actually, if you look at the green dots, that's the average performance across all subjects. What you'll see is that K rises from 1 to 2 and to 3, but after 3, it's pretty much actually showing a monotonic decline. In other words, the number of colors people can actually recognize and recall and report and deal with is actually going down at set sizes that are larger than apparent capacity estimates. So for set size 8, the number of reportable colors is actually lower than the number of reportable colors for set size 3. This has also been shown with contralateral delay activity. Oh, wait, another key thing. This pattern of monotonic decline, it's really evident for lower capacity subjects. What you're looking at here is a median split. So blue is low capacity, red is high capacity. High capacity subjects, they show a little bit of a dip at the end, but they're for the most part kind of flat. After they get the maximum number that they can store, they can kind of keep that number in working memory, even at relatively huge set sizes. But with the low capacity subjects, we see this much more marked decline. This is a very robust interaction that's been observed many times. See the same thing with contralateral delay activity. It tends to be maintained as you go from set size 3 up to 8, but for lower capacity subjects, we see this measurable decline in contralateral delay activity, another neural measure of the number of things that they're storing in memory. So what do we see when we look at pointer-related activity? So this is content-independent load activity. Well, this is the average once again, and this is the pointer activity divided up by capacity, where the high capacity subjects are flattening out after load 2. The low capacity subjects are showing a pretty pronounced decline in the number of pointers that appear to be deployed as we go to higher and higher set sizes. This also, I think, this whole empirical pattern provides a pretty good counter to one comment and critique that we've gotten in literally every paper and talk that we have presented these data in, which is, what about effort? Is it possible that this content-independent signal we're talking about is nothing more than the effort subjects are putting in? Well, if we ask subjects to judge their effort in experiments like this, then we get a result like this. Not surprisingly, they argue that they are giving more and more effort as the number of items they're asked to be responsible for goes up. We've done this many times. And what you see is that that's not what's happening here. And in fact, it's the subjects who are struggling the most with the task that show less of this pointer-related activity, which also seems to be pretty contrary to this intuitive explanation that we're tracking effort. And if you'd like to, I'll get onto my soapbox about how I think effort is really a pretty bad construct that's not well defined and not well thought out by anybody other than reviewer 2. And I think that we need to think much more carefully about how we define effort and what we really mean by effort. And that I'm kind of on that trail. We're just about to launch an experiment where we orthogonally manipulate effort and load, and I'm hoping that we will get some clear answers there. Here is a follow-up experiment that I just want to show quickly, where Henry varied the load from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, 4, 6, and 8. And the reason why we thought this was important was that in the data I just showed you, it just jumps up from 0 to 2. And we would like to be able to observe the monotonic increase from 1 to 2 to 3 to just convince ourselves we're in the same territory as the other experiments where we see this orderly movement along a load axis instead of just always being on the flat part of the curve. So we get quite reasonable data here. The reason we're in negative territory here is that this model was trained to discriminate between set sizes, I think 2 and 3, or maybe it was 1 and 3. I'm a little bit fuzzy in my memory here, but all you really need to pay attention to is that as you go up on the y-axis, there is more pointer-related activity that's being inferred by the same hierarchical method. And so this is just a nice follow-up that seems to be replicating pretty much what I showed you in that last experiment. We haven't yet gotten to the point of splitting based on individual differences because we're still completing the sample for this experiment. Okay, so pointer activity plateaus when the number of items exceeds the capacity estimates that you see in various different experimental behavioral paradigms. It also differs in a very orderly way between high and low capacity subjects that echoes past behavioral experiments and past contralateral delay activity experiments. And also we can show this dissociation in the pattern of pointer activity across set sizes and these subjective reports of effort, which is therefore reviewer 2. And so our broad conclusions are that we have 2 distinct classes of neural activity. We've clearly got feature-specific activity that varies as a function of content, but also content-independent activity, which we're arguing may be the key bottleneck for differences in capacity across individuals. Then also, I'm really excited to kind of follow up on this idea that working memory gating and covert attention may be different aspects of our voluntary ability to control what we're thinking about and what information we're taking in. Thank you very much. Even though I skipped that slide, I only left 4 minutes, I see. But,
Thank you. Any questions?
yes.
People are thinking, yeah, look, thank you. There's so much to think about in that talk. But an easy one, your definition of a pointer. How conceptually and theoretically does a pointer differ from object-based coding? The idea that the thing that you store as an object, is there any difference conceptually or theoretically between the idea of a perceptual object, object-based attention, and a pointer, other than there's sort of a temporal dimension as well?
Yeah. I think it typically maps right onto objects in most of these types of paradigms. However, I kind of like to be more broad and think about entities or chunks, which sometimes can be comprised of multiple objects. So for example, a phrase like penny for your thoughts. Well, this is an idiom which I think people would be able to store as a chunk in memory. And so we would predict that you might get 1 pointer to that entire idiom, even though most people might argue that there's more than 1 object there. Likewise, if you have a flock of birds and you're trying to judge the approximate numerosity of that entire flock, it'll be viewed as 1 object, but many visual scientists would say that's not 1 object, it's a group of objects.
So my PhD student, Leslie, was going to talk to you this afternoon, and he's actually interested in redundancy. And so what he's interested in doing is actually just having numbers of common coloured objects.
Yes.
And what it appears is that the overall load is dependent on the number of unique colours. And he's basically arguing that it's well captured by a kind of Gestalt story. So if you've got multiple possibly spatially separated patches of the same colour, they're effectively being encoded in a single object. Is that consistent with the way you're conceiving of pointers there?
Yes, it really is. Here's one experiment that Henry published in Psych Science about a year ago, where he was presenting these dot clouds, essentially. And the instructions for their subjects in this experiment were, remember the polar angle and the exact shape of each of these dot clouds. And here what you see is that the reason he used these dot clouds is because he could have them superimposed on each other, partially overlapping or not overlapping at all. It allowed him to kind of independently manipulate spatially attended regions and the number of entities or clouds in this case that they were holding in memory. And so whether it's thin or broad or overlapping, you get a neural signature, a load of 1 for each of these clouds. Now, we've done in past experiments, we've presented pretty similar types of blue and green stimuli, but asked them to count the number of blue things. And now it depends on how many there are. Right now, if you have 3 blue things, you'll get a monotonic change from 1 to 2 to 3 dots. So I think that really fits this idea, right? That if you view it from a global perspective as one cloud, and it is a load of 1. If you view each dot as its own entity, now you're doing a subitizing or a numerical approximation task, and you get loads that really vary with the number of items or the number of dots. And we've got similar results with perceptual grouping of Kanitsa figures. And also it turns out words like cat. Cat is a load of 1. And I think that's kind of fascinating because any of those 3 letters could have changed and it would be a different word. Could have been can or mat. And yet, even though they have to individuate all 3 letters and discriminate their identities to know that it's the word cat, you don't start off with a load of 3 and then have it drop down to 1. It's just always one thing. And that, I think, is interesting. It shows that something about the building of chunk representations is happening prior to the onset of these kinds of load signals. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for absolutely fantastic talk. Love the quite separable models in RSA as well. That's very hard to achieve, I know. I guess I had a question about the stability of some of these patterns over time and what that might tell you about some of these codes. I know with RSA it's probably a little bit harder to disentangle, but do you know if these sort of patterns tended to sort of correlate with each other over time as well, or the sort of distinctions between loads? I guess if you did something like a temporal generalization approach or something, did these look similar while the stimuli were being presented compared to the delay period, or yeah, was there anything else that you would get?
We've done those kinds of generalization analyses quite a bit. And we tend to find a pretty similar empirical pattern that for about the first half a second after we present different loads, the load signature shows not much generalizability for about half a second. So for about 500 milliseconds, you see a diagonal in your temporal generalization plot. And then it starts generalizing after that. And for pretty much for the rest of the delay period, you see decent generalization such that early time points after 500 milliseconds can be used to classify late time points at the end of the delay period pretty effectively. So it does seem like it's pretty stable pointer related pattern after 500 milliseconds for at least a second and a half or 2.
That's it. Thanks.
I had a question about one of the results from experiment 2. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you saw a distinction between visual modality-specific persistence across the delay period and auditory modality-specific persistence. I was wondering if you could talk about what's going on there. Is that a theoretically interesting distinction, or is it methodological?
You know, what I will admit immediately is that while we saw that result in that experiment, we've run other experiments where we didn't find clear visual load activity. So it hasn't been a super robust result in our lab. I thought it bore mention here because it looked sustained, it looked real, and yet in other experiments we haven't always found that. For example, in the color motion experiments, we didn't really find a color load signal that worked very well. We've also done recent experiments. We just published one, Leo Chang just published a study comparing multivariate load signals for words and colors. And here again, the the material specific load patterns were kind of spotty. So for that reason, we haven't put a lot of thought into what they really mean. It's easy for me to say, well, it could be color specific visual cortex activity. We know that the visual cortex with MRI provides a nice classification of which color people are holding. So we would expect some kind of sustained activity in there, but I'm just waving my hands and I'm not sure how to explain why we didn't see it the next time.
Thanks.
Question about the, you said the spatial attention in the study too, I think it only emerged once you saw the second stimulus.
Yeah.
But for your pointers, it seemed to start before
From the first.
that. And how does that work?
Well, for the pointers, if you're if you're storing three things, you always get something in the first temporal position. So therefore, your probability of getting something in the first temporal position for load 3 is 100%, but only 33% for load 1. But for the spatial attention condition, you're always going to start somewhere. And so once you start somewhere, you have no information essentially about whether it's going to be a 3 attended or a 1 attended trial. Only when the second position occurs in the same position, now you have 100% certainty that only one location will be attended in that trial. So I think that's the moment in time where there's any difference between those conditions. It's a little confusing. I found that confusing at first too, but after thinking about it for a while, it works.
Any last question? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, that was great. I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist, so my question might be back on the soapbox of effort.
Yes.
So really interesting seeing the dissociation there. Do you have any sense? I'm interested in people's insight to their cognitive processes.
Yeah.
And I suspect that we lack a lot of insight. But I wonder if you ask people, if you said to people, this is difficult, it is effortful, do you think people would have insight into whether they were in that high capacity versus lower capacity median split? Like, I don't know, any thoughts on insight of the fact that this is effortful, yet some people are better at it and some people are not as good?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't have an immediate answer for it. One thing we do know is that if you ask people to report all 6 items in a display, curiously, they tend to report the ones they remembered first. So they tend to show what looks like pretty strong meta-knowledge of which ones they stored the best. However, people also often have lapse trials where they will report 6 colors, but they'll be about as accurate as if they were blindfolded during that. Like they're literally at chance, right? And interestingly, during those lapse trials, they still will believe that they got the first 3. So like what Kirsten Adam did in a beautiful paper was have them use the left mouse button if they thought they had any information at all, and the right mouse button if they thought they were guessing, they thought there was nothing in memory. And people will tend to use the right mouse button for the first 3 things they report. They tend to use the left mouse button for the first 3 things and the right mouse button for the last 3 things. And when you look at their actual objective measures of guessing in those experiments, their mouse clicks are beautifully correlated with when they actually appear to be guessing. But if you focus on the lapse trials where they're at chance, they still think they're doing about as well. So my suspicion is that introspections about failure are not so great, even though they do have a pretty good meta-knowledge of what they're trying to take in and which ones they're sort of prioritizing for whatever reason.
Okay, great. I'll invite you to stay for lunch, and ask more questions to Ed we'll have plenty of time till 2. So, and so people who have other meeting can go to them. But thank you.